Jorge Ramos has been valorized as this kind of journalistic folk hero, especially since he was ejected from a Trump rally in 2016. So, of course, everybody rushed to declare him this incredibly important and pivotal figure in U.S. journalism. But he's kind of a hack, to be honest. And his hackiness was evident in his questioning of the candidates last night at the ABC debate, where he, for some godforsaken reason, was a moderator. So let me play you the most egregious example, and we will discuss.
Vamos a hablar de América Latina. You haven't been asked about Latin America in the previous debate, so let's begin. Senator Sanders, one country where many immigrants are arriving from is Venezuela. A recent UN fact-finding mission found that thousands have been disappeared, tortured, and killed by government forces in Venezuela. You admit that Venezuela does not have free elections, but still you refuse to call Nicolás Maduro un dictador, a dictator. Can you explain why, and what are the main differences between your kind of socialism and the one being imposed in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua?
So there's Ramos bringing up Venezuela, which is certainly an important topic, but he forgot to mention the most obviously important aspect of the issue of Venezuela with regard to U.S. policy, which is that the U.S. government has been attempting to overthrow the leader of Venezuela for 8 months. The U.S. has sought to engineer a coup in Venezuela for 8 months, since January. Now, you could argue that attempts on the part of the U.S. to topple that government go back even further, but it really intensified and became an acute issue in January. Now, the media has largely forgotten about this, apparently, and haven't really followed up much, but for a while it was a headline story, but the initiative pretty obviously failed. John Bolton, who was one of its pioneers, is now gone, and it's sort of receded from public consciousness, but that doesn't diminish the significance of that aspect of the story. So for Ramos not to make any mention whatsoever of this pretty salient fact shows his fundamental shallowness. He would rather try to goad Bernie into distinguishing himself from Venezuela, which is basically only a half step away from the typical Republican talking point, which conflates all notions of socialism, which is a broad intellectual and political tradition, whether you agree with it or not. Ramos tries to conflate democratic socialism as espoused by Bernie Sanders with Venezuela, which is basically just a cheap talking point. It would have been a little more fruitful, I would think, to get the candidates to opine on their view of the very recent attempt, and still arguably ongoing attempt by the U.S. government to topple the Venezuelan leadership. But didn't occur to Ramos. Apparently, now he had been detained briefly by Venezuelan authorities when he went there to interview Maduro a few months ago. So I guess you could expect that he has less than flattering views on Maduro that stem from that incident, but that's no excuse. So let's hear what Bernie had to say in response.
Well, first of all, let me be very clear. Anybody who does what Maduro does is a vicious tyrant. What we need now is international and regional cooperation for free elections in Venezuela so that the people of that country can create their own future. In terms of democratic socialism, to equate what goes on in Venezuela with what I believe is extremely unfair. I'll tell you what I believe in terms of democratic socialism. I agree with what goes on in Canada and in Scandinavia, guaranteeing health care to all people as a human right. I believe that the United States should not be the only major country on earth not to provide paid family and medical leave. I believe that every worker in this country deserves a living wage and that we expand the trade union movement. I happen to believe also that what, to me, democratic socialism means is we deal with an issue we do not discuss enough, Jorge, not in the media and not in Congress. You got 3 people in America owning more wealth than the bottom half of this country. You got a handful of billionaires controlling what goes on in Wall Street, the insurance companies, and in the media. Maybe, just maybe, what we should be doing is creating an economy that works for all of us, not 1%. That's my understanding of democratic socialism.
Now, if you notice, Bernie also did not bring up the rather salient fact that the U.S. has been seeking to topple the Venezuelan government. Instead, he decided to rehearse some of the expected talking points about how Maduro is a tyrant and whatnot. Now, let's say Maduro is a tyrant. How is that relevant in terms of U.S. policy, which has been one of regime change? By screaming tyrant, dictator, murder, whatever, you, in essence, give credence or give license to those who want the U.S. to take an active role in overthrowing that government. So you're almost buying into a framing that, by implication, would necessitate or at least justify policy that seeks to engineer that outcome. And it's true that Bernie was asked a sort of frivolously confrontational question, and he only has limited time, so you can't necessarily expect him to expound on every single aspect of the Venezuela subject. But, again, if this is not front of mind for you when discussing Venezuela, I have to somewhat question your priorities. And Julian Castro decided to weigh in and kind of seal the deal about how poorly this subject was treated. So let's hear that.
So you wanted to say a quick response, 45 seconds.
Sure, thank you, Jorge. I'll call Maduro a dictator because he is a dictator. And what we need to do is to, along with our allies, make sure that the Venezuelan people get the assistance that they need, that we continue to pressure Venezuela so that they'll have free and fair elections, and also here in the United States, offer temporary protected status, TPS, to Venezuelans. That is something that the Trump administration has failed to do. For all of his big talk about supporting the Venezuelan American community, he has failed. I will not. I also believe that we need to do things like a 21st century Marshall Plan for Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala so that people can find safety and opportunity at home instead of having to make the dangerous journey to the United States. And under my administration, we're going to put renewed focus on Latin America. It makes sense. They're our neighbors, and we have a lot of things in common. It also makes sense that because we have a country like China that is going around the world to places like Africa and Latin America, making their own relationships, strengthening those. The United States needs to strengthen its partnerships in Latin America immediately.
Thank you, sir.
And I will.
Okay, so maybe I'm a broken record on this, but if you watch that entire exchange and you're just a casual news consumer, you're not fully abreast of all the recent developments in this subject area, you would have no idea that the U.S. has been seeking to overthrow the government of Venezuela, that it's been engaged in a regime change initiative in Venezuela. It's just out of sight, out of mind. The moderators don't particularly care. The candidates addressing it don't particularly care. And that's how the U.S. addiction to regime change and to interventionism and to toppling foreign governments and to being involved in all manner of affairs abroad that they have no right legally or ethically to be involved in. That's how that mindset gets perpetuated, because it gets swept under the rug and it gets just ignored while candidates decide to preen about how a certain disfavored leader is a dictator or whatever. Maybe he is a dictator, maybe he isn't. But for the purposes of U.S. policy, that's not relevant. And so it goes. I have a hunch that if Tulsi were in this debate and were asked to address that issue, we would have heard something along the lines that I'm specifying, but the DNC, in its infinite wisdom, decided to exclude her on spurious grounds, as many of you are familiar. Okay, talk to you later.